Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where in the world you may be listening right now. Welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Strategies for Securing Your Supply Chain, sponsored by Act Zero and broadcast by Informa. Terry Sweeney here with Dark Reading. I'll be your moderator today. Just a few quick announcements before we start. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, and share this webinar on social media. This is also where you'll participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You can also download a copy of the slides using the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we'll be asking you to provide feedback using that same survey widget found at the bottom of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before you leave us today, as your feedback provides valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the help widget found at the bottom of your screen. You can also type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one help. Now on to today's presentation, Strategies for Securing Your Supply Chain. Discussing today's topic is John Paranti, President of IP Architects, who has designed and implemented security and risk management strategies, enterprise resilience capabilities, and threat and vulnerability management solutions. John's worked with customers in financial services, insurance, energy, and a host of others on a global scale for more than 25 years. Once John's done, we'll hear from Adam Mansour, who's Chief Security Officer at Act Zero. Also a thought leader in cyber technology, Adam began working in cybersecurity in 2005. In his capacity at Act Zero, Adam drives the company's virtual Chief Information Security Officer and technology integration programs, as well as contributing to the company's evolution as a leading managed detection and response service provider. John Paranti, please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you all for joining us today. As Adam and I were thinking about this conversation and thinking about this topic, we really were diving into how important this is becoming to us. And in our conversation today, we're going to start out by talking about supply chain security as a growing concern and a source of vulnerability. We're really going to spend a lot of time talking through the 5 key considerations for improving information technologies, supply chain security, and then we're going to do some final thoughts. So let's dive right in. So supply chain security is definitely a growing concern. We often have ignored this vector. For years and years and years, we assume if we protect ourselves, we're going to be okay. If we take care of our environments, we're going to be okay. If we use our technologies, our protective technologies, our capabilities, we'll do what we can do. And we'll focus on what we can control, not what we can influence. Because the idea of looking at our third parties, the idea of looking at our supply chain and saying, you need to do better, well, it was assumed that we have contractual mechanisms. We have capabilities. We have something, but we can only influence. We can't force somebody to do something in their business model, and we just assume they're going to do the right things for us, that their interests are aligned with our interests. Unfortunately, in times of recent note, we've learned that that may not just be the case. And we're learning more and more that as we're getting stronger as organizations protecting ourselves, we're only as strong as our weakest link. So supply chain typically has become the lowest ranked or least perceived risk area, and they're often ignored because they're not something that we obviously call out and think about. We get these moments of a resurgence, though. So a couple of years ago, the Target hack was a really big, interesting conversation that said, wow, the game's changing. The adversary's changing. The conversation's changing. So Target did a great job building up great internal security capabilities, had a great security team, still does, have a great security program and great team and great capabilities and things like that. But they fell victim to the idea that an HVAC vendor had network access into their environment, and they're working on a flat network. So the idea of a third party bringing into their environment and somehow being a benign third party, like an HVAC vendor, didn't really think about. They didn't consider it. They didn't understand the implications of what that could do. And by not factoring that into their risk profiling and their risk of how to work and what would work, they hadn't really thought about the controls they need to put in place. More recently, we've had SolarWinds. In the SolarWinds situation, we actually had patches work against us. And myself and others, and Adam, I think, would agree, we've been telling people we got to patch Patch as fast as you can. We've been conditioned to implement patches as soon as possible because patches essentially are a disclosure of the vendors of our supply chain saying there's a weakness, there's a concern, there's something we need to address, there's a deficiency in our software. They've given you the fix. They've given you the way to do it. So by design, we keep telling people patch, 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 patch. And we should still do this, by the way. I'm not at all suggesting that we shouldn't. But we have to understand now the adversary community realize that behavior has taken hold and has become a cultural concept that we put in place in many organizations as we're forwarding our security goals. And now we have to say, how can we leverage that? So in SolarWinds, we have that trusted patch that actually ended up being our weakness. We also know that products and services that are acquired often include their own complex supply chain. So when we buy something from a vendor, from a large software provider or something like that, we don't always consider the fact that they themselves are using third-party vendors, open source repositories, and contractors of these, in the development of these tools and capabilities. And the identities, the locations, and the trustworthiness of these individuals or entities or capabilities are often unclear or unknown. Because the idea of going beyond first hop or first capability to that is almost unthinkable from an examination and audit, a process that we follow, because the idea should be that we are buying something, a service or a product or a capability from a provider that we trust. We're assuming they're doing the right things. And they're doing the same. And the chain just goes longer and longer and longer and longer. In some situations, you have 6, 7, 8 layers of chain of third parties kicked in before you actually get to the primary capability. So it's my view, and I believe it's Adam's view as well, that information security focus needs to expand to include partners and vendors that support your business activities. We need to continually understand their impact on business activities and processes. We have to understand, how does our third-party landscape affect us? What does that mean? How does it work? What is it coming into? Because they are a real source of vulnerability for us, because we are only going to be as strong as they are. We are only going to be as strong as the weakest link. So as we kind of forward this conversation, we wanted to give you 5 key considerations for improving information technology supply chain security. So number 1, you cannot protect what you do not know. Make sure we have an inventory of suppliers and capabilities provided. Observability and accountability and understanding of our environment is one of the greatest challenges that I see in the organizations that I work in and work with. And I've been doing this work for over 30 years on a global scale. This is not something that's SMB, it's not mid-enterprise, it's not large enterprise, it's everywhere. We often don't really understand all the things we're using. And as we're starting to use great capabilities like cloud concepts and software as a service and MSP capabilities and things like that, we have less and less visibility into what's going on from an IT perspective, because we have the quote-unquote shadow IT problem. We don't necessarily know what's going on. We don't necessarily understand who's providing what or what access they might have to our sensitive data assets, our networks, our environments, because we don't necessarily have that visibility, because in an IT group, we typically know about what we procure, what we use, the vendors we work with. But we don't necessarily understand other people in the organization may be engaging with third parties in a supply chain way in ways that we don't understand. So we've got to make sure we identify the IT-related products and services that are provided to us and what business value they provide. That's also a key understanding. Where are we going to be hurt the most if something bad happens? What are the things that we have to understand that are material to our organization? And scrutinize them, especially the material ones, the ones that can hurt us the most, the ones that we say, oh my gosh, if this were to be effective in a negative way, this could be really painful to our business operation. It could cause us to have real business continuity issues. Identify processes and capabilities that rely on third-party technology and capabilities. So what do we have in our applications, our services and solutions and infrastructure and data assets that they interact with? What are those things? What are those things included? It can't just be, hey, we're buying a service from a SaaS provider. Well, what are the applications and services and solutions? What are they working with? How do they interact with our environment? Do they interact with our environment? How could they have a failing that could hurt our business model and our business operations? As we become more cloud-centric in our organizational models, and a lot of organizations, we have failed to realize the fact that now we become highly dependent upon those cloud providers and what they provide and their resiliency and what their capabilities are and how their capabilities interact with our data assets and our systems and our capabilities. So while these are all positive steps, these are all good ideas, these are all forward-thinking ideas, they have their challenges. And the adversary is always looking for that weakness. They're always looking to exploit that conversation. What I like to say is we need to create a risk-based inventory that classifies the third parties based on their importance and value to your organization. We can't effectively manage all third parties if they're considered equal in importance or risk. It's impossible for us to say that everything is created equal. It's impossible for us to say that we can't take some degree of loss. That's what risk management's all about. Where can we take loss? Where can we take risk? Where is it appropriate for us to say, if something were to be effective in this way, okay, it may be not fun, it may not be something that we like or have some impact, but it won't be material to us. Now, where I like to store this information, especially from an IT perspective, is I believe that we should use our configuration management databases to store these inventories. So we have the CMDBs that we've been building out in a lot of organizations, in a lot of places, and they're really very powerful if we use them well. So we shouldn't just use CMDBs for our own capabilities. We should understand in our CMDBs what are the assets that connect to other things. What are dependencies? What are our integrations? What else are we using? How do they interact with those assets that we have in those CMDBs? The reason I like to use a CMDB or a CMDB-like concept is also to have a searchable database that we can use to quickly identify if and when there are vulnerabilities once we become aware of third-party vulnerabilities. So once we understand them, once somebody tells us, once something happens, we need to know where we're affected, where we're impacted. In recent times, we've had things like the Log4j vulnerability that really shook the core of a lot of the organizations I work with, and the peers I talk to say the same thing, that many organizations really felt as though we didn't know where we were vulnerable. We didn't know where to start. We didn't know where to look. We were doing our best to understand what vendors we work with, where we work with them, what we work with them. And even to this day, months later, we're still uncovering situations where we thought we had coverage or we thought we weren't challenged, where we are. And we have vendors coming out with advisory saying, hey, if you're using this version of our code, you might be in trouble. But if you're using this version, you're A-OK. Well, it makes it very hard for us to be able to decipher whether or not we have a vulnerability or not if we don't have a place to query that and search for that. In the future, I think that it's going to become more and more important as the Log4j type concepts start coming up and the adversaries act faster on those vulnerabilities, where we need to have at a moment's notice an understanding of where we can be affected, how we can be affected, what's going to be affected, and what decisions we have to make against those. I also think we should identify business processes and data types that are impacted by IT supply chain vulnerabilities. As we have more integrations, as we're sourcing more capabilities, as we're doing all these good business practices that say, let's let others help us and support our business activities, we have to understand how can they affect us in a negative way. Can somebody go through a third party into our environment? It's happened in many occasions where the adversary has a target organization that they want to go after, but instead of going after them directly because they know their controls are strong and their capabilities are strong, instead they'll go after their third parties. They'll disable the third parties. They'll use them as entry into the primary target. They'll do many things to disrupt the ability of the primary target to do its business and do its capabilities. Adam, I think you've got some great stuff on the AI side. You want to talk about this as well. So why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, John. Absolutely. I think many people are wondering, what happens when one of these issues occurs, right? When we think about the supply chain, there may be software installed on our endpoints. They may be network suppliers to us. They may be, components within our cloud or accessing our cloud systems, such as Microsoft or Amazon. And so it's important to understand that that's still within your control, right? Those are still things that IT and security practitioners have as an environment that they still have to protect, regardless of whether a component or a supplier is at some point going to be installed on their systems. And so what's really been helpful is that once they sort of enter those apps, it's really a very familiar process for them to try to live off the land and exploit, take data, destroy systems, right? And essentially, those are sort of the last mile of attack that we're really worried about. One of the most amazing advances over the past several years at handling those changes in behavior within those systems is to use AI-enabled processes. So one of the things we love to inform people about is, what can you expect out of your AI in 2022 for this type of protection, right? Where are the good use cases that are enabling the, EDR, EPP, the network security, and the cloud logging and detection and response at finding these attacks when they occur, even if there's not a direct notice, an indicator of attack, IPs, file names that we know to look for. How do we sort of analyze that? How does a system analyze that to be able to hopefully adapt on the fly and block these things? And so some of the best use cases that we've seen in protecting attacks like Log4j or like Exchange Happium, where the adversary is, exploiting a vulnerability in a component or in an application we simply can't live without, and how do they react or how do they act once they take that control, right? And so this is where some of the best use cases appear, right? Where the abnormal behavior of the actual system that is now controlled through that application or that component is something that can, of course, turn into a detection and a block, right? A quarantine or a kill of a process, right? Things that your SOC would try to do by hand, but simply wouldn't have the visibility from log data or the ability to act in every case at the right speed to block this. And Kaseya is a great example of, taking over tens of thousands of machines through a supplier and then immediately deploying ransomware to as many as they possibly can, right? Understanding that those use cases are really good at looking at things like process behavior or file-based malware, where you have a component installed on the machine, or human versus machine, when you think about people taking over your accounts, and things like Office 365 are really important, because your software suppliers and the components within them usually lead to a compromise that then the behavior can help you identify and block. There are also, things that AI is bad at doing, right? When John talks about building a CMDB, vulnerability database, risk-based prioritization, he's absolutely right. You should do that, right? You know that context. Having AI try to do that for you is providing third-party risk is not very valuable, because it's not going to know what exactly is critical. For some people, who are outsourced IT MSSPs, maybe SolarWinds is a critical application. For the Department of Energy, they uninstalled it immediately after hearing they were compromised, right? So, understanding what your actual priorities are is something that AI is somewhat bad at. When you think about the asset and inventory dependencies and the ways that you would react if a certain supplier had to go offline or be taken out of the loop, or in some way segmented because of their risk profile, that's not something that your AI is going to be able to map dependencies on. And it's also not going to be able to start correlating events, let's say, with a third-party risk assessment saying that vendor A got breached in their SaaS software to, here's all the components that you have that are installed from that vendor, right? That's that categorization classification not that great. So all to say that AI can be a very effective tool in handling the sort of behavior once something on your endpoint networking cloud is compromised, but not going to help you 100% in every situation where you're trying to build those classifications, do those third-party assessments, or try to build a correlation between outside world events and inside world events for your suppliers. I'll pass it back to you, John, to keep going.
Thanks, Adam. I think it's a really smart point and a really great point talking about how we can leverage AI, because there is so much out there. There is so much that we need to understand. There is so much that we have to figure out and say, well, once we have these people in our environments, once we have these suppliers, once we have this supply chain assisting our success, we need to understand those behaviors, baseline those activities, and continue to monitor them and continue to adjust, because as risk and security professionals and as IT professionals, we're not going to be involved in those business decisions every day. We're not going to understand who they're engaging, when they're engaging, why they're engaging, or what's going on in a way that we can be intimate as much as we probably want to be or would like to get to if we can someday. And I think your point on using AI to understand and start baselining some of those conversations as part of the understanding of visibility of the supply chain is really important. It's a really great point. So I want to move us along a little bit, and I want to get us to number 2, which is the kind of required disclosure of open source software components. Now, this is always a controversial conversation when it comes to open source. There are so many views on open source. I am not here to say that I'm not a fan of open source. I think open source has its place, and there's good places for open source, and there's things that open source does. But we have to realize today, too, that when you look at the actual software development cycles that we're seeing of major organizations, minor organizations, development community, we're assembling more code than we're writing in many cases. There's been a lot of situations and studies that I've been involved with and I've seen and I've read from development communities and such that say typically these days we're assembling 80% of code and writing 20% of code. And that may not be a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad idea. Why recreate the wheel over and over and over again? But the one thing that I think that we've had in the last couple of years, especially with Log4j recently and Heartbleed 5 years before, which was the last time we had this major conversation, is that the romantic notions that often existed regarding the security of open source libraries and components, those aren't real. The idea that the community is constantly self-policing, that there's security professionals running through this code on a regular basis, that we're even properly doing everything we can with all of our detection tools and capabilities, and I think there's another area where Adam's point around AI becomes really useful and really helpful, that we have this notion out there for years and years and years that the open source community is constantly evaluating or enhancing the security of the code. Not realistic. I mean, the one thing we know for sure in the case of Heartbleed was that there were 2 gentlemen out of Germany who looked at the code over 4 years in the OpenSSL libraries. There was no enhancement, and there was no requirement for them to do anything other than to say that they were sorry to the community when the problem came through. Because there's no accountability in open source. It's a get what you get. You take what you get. You take it at your own risk. And if we think about what happened in Log4j, we look at all the vendors that are primary vendors, the ones that we really think about and care about, especially guys like VMware, who were noted as being one of the most vulnerable and most exploited areas so far in the Log4j conversation. How much they have pervasively used open source code like Log4j throughout their environments was amazing. It was an eye-opener. And we didn't know these things necessarily. It was buried or not disclosed. So one of the things that I think we can do in the conversation when it comes to the use of supply chain security and things like that is require the idea of disclosure of all open source components that are included in their products and services. We call this a security bill of a software bill of materials, or an SBOM. It should include the version number, the license details, and the acquisition source of that code. Because by design, the different license models for open source are supposed to release. There is not supposed to be anything proprietary about this. There's not supposed to be anything that any vendor should be able to say and say, no, can't tell you about that, don't want to tell you about that because it's open source. The whole idea of open source is that it can be used by anybody under appropriate licensing, under appropriate requirements. Now, I do see lots of vendors who push back on this conversation on a regular basis, especially smaller vendors, especially those who are doing some really interesting work in more advanced technologies, advanced areas, saying that, we don't want to disclose this because we don't necessarily want you to know how much we're doing versus how much we're using in open source. And the answer that I have for this that I've found has been very effective and I've used many times in the last 15, 20 years having this conversation is what I call the Coca-Cola rebuttal. If we think about Coca-Cola, it is well known that the formula for Coca-Cola is one of the greatest trade secrets in the world. It's well studied. It's well documented. There's some who claim they've had access to it. There's great media attention on the vault where the formula is stored. And the way that Coca-Cola gets around FDA requirements and U.S. FDA requirements around disclosure of materials and disclosure of ingredients inside of its product is a natural flavors principle. And says, look, we're going to expose all the things we need to expose about what's in our product. Carbonated water, sucrose, caramel, phosphoric acid, all those wonderful things. And then we have this thing called natural flavors. And that's the proprietary nature. That's the proprietary portion of the recipe. That's the proprietary trade secret area where they don't have to disclose all the details of the trade secret, but they're disclosing all the areas that are not proprietary. They're disclosing all the things that aren't necessarily sourced to them and specific to them. And that's the happy medium. Now, I can't tell you that this is always going to work because, as I said earlier, there are a certain number of vendors who feel as though exposed the community of how little code they're writing of their own and how much they're using of open source and modifying open source may work against them from a marketing, from a go-to-market, from a positioning perspective, which I don't necessarily believe is true, but they often do. So we've got to be careful on this, and we've got to make sure that we require that disclosure. Because when a Log4j shows up, like it did in December, and we all got the 10 out of 10 alerts from the CISA organization in the United States, from global groups and global security organizations, we can't have a situation where we don't know what's going on. Because those products were going to affect us in a negative way, and those vendors weren't ready. A lot of vendors who had Log4j vulnerabilities to this day have not completed their remediation activities, do not have full remediation concepts. Literally daily, just this morning, I got posts of updates from vendors, products, and services that my clients use that are being updated to say, oh, we found more coverage, we found more exposure. And we didn't disclose that previously because we didn't necessarily know how to disclose it. Now here's your fix. That's months later. VMware, over a month before we had valid patches. We had workarounds, but actually valid patches for the key products and key services that they had from the time we had disclosure. A month is a lifetime to the adversary. A month is a lifetime to the people who can deal with this stuff. And that's why we got to keep forwarding disclosure notice so that we can react appropriately in our business activities and our business operations to say, we don't want to stop you from using this code. We don't want to prevent you from being successful. We're customers. We benefit from your capabilities and products and services, but we need to have visibility so we can make risk-based decisions when it comes to our approach of what happens if something does come up and it does take you time to correct. And you do need time to figure things out. And that's where that disclosure becomes so important. I think Adam's got some really great stuff, too, on testing and red teaming that might be useful as we talk about this conversation as well. What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that you have various different kinds of suppliers, the other thing to do is prepare for the eventuality that they are going to be compromised, right? They're going to be compromised by an attacker. That's who we're waiting for. That's what these vulnerabilities are intended to, keep at bay. And so if we have the idea that we're going to simulate that attack, it really helps understand for the different types of providers how we're supposed to react, right? Put the control, put the understanding back on the things we have to do when something like this is either user reported, reported by the vendor. A lot of people probably told you about, or maybe didn't, in John's examples, they maybe didn't even know they had Log4j exposure. But if you're an application supplier, right, and think of, a team viewer, right, or one of these remote, management apps like Kaseya that, did get compromised, right? What happens if that is controlled by an attacker? If that's reported by your user group, how would you simulate, the action plan? How do you go dark on that? How do you restrict their use? How do you get rid of them, right? If you see, the people like the Department of Economics or other places affected by things like SolarWinds and they removed the product, right? They had the ability to identify where it was installed and remove it, right? So you need that run book. You need that ability to react to these things, to calculate the way to get out of these problems when they occur, right? Similarly, if you have like a service supplier, right? Like they got, Lumen PDF, maybe that never made your inventory, right? Nitro or something, some widget in your browser that converts documents to a PDF. What if that was in some way exploitable or compromised, right? The idea is that there's going to be a fallout from that. So the way to test those is to basically test, credential loss or ransomware or something, and then see how you'd react to one or multiple systems in that state, right? The user reporting it or an agent or something reporting it and saying, hey, you know what, this is happening on my machine. What am I supposed to do? And measuring your time for those kinds of things, right? SaaS suppliers, no different, right? You have a responsibility when you put your data in those services to disclose to places like privacy offices. Do you know all of the links for all of the different contacts? What if you're a global organization and that CRM, all that PII, it belongs to different countries, right? If you're, B2C, you might have people in everywhere from Germany to the United States, and it's different state to state in terms of what you're supposed to do to disclose. It's very different in California versus Texas and Iowa. You have to know how to escalate those types of things. So practice here is really important because, the idea is that type of information is shared responsibility. They can get breached and say, sorry, we got our CRM got hacked, but it's your data, it's your customers, it's your responsibility to tell them that their data was in there, right? Similarly, if you think about software suppliers, we talked about Log4j and OpenSSL at length because they have pretty famous attacks, right? Those attacks are going to get a lot of notoriety, right? So what is the answer to the CEO on how are we protected from Log4j, right? What is the answer to the CEO? Are we protected against Heartbleed? Right? And outside of, vulnerability scans or something, do you have the concept of being able to go through an index, that CMDB, find out where that component is in all of your software and act accordingly, right? Take certain systems offline that aren't patched, maybe, depending on the risk posture. It really does help to understand, what your actual action plan is. Because if it's, we'll look into it, and you're not prepared to answer questions like that, knowing that these attacks and these vulnerabilities are happening time and time again, that's just, you're not prepared, right? So it's much more helpful to practice these, get the right metrics in, talk about the time it takes to recover from something like this. If somebody was to take over TeamViewer right now, how long before you had control back, right? If somebody were to take over Salesforce and breach, how long before you'd be able to start sending notices to your customers about what happened, right? And so it's really important to be able to do that because now there's starting to be financial penalties depending on what kind of data was lost, and certainly supplier, brand damage that you're getting with your own customers if you're not disclosing early, right? Similarly, you want to be able to test these things under perfect conditions and then alter those conditions, right? A lot of people test these plans and go, great, beginning to end, everybody in the same room, middle of the day with lunch served, we did a great job. But that's not when they hit you, right? They look at Super Bowl Sunday and the evening and Thanksgiving as opportunities for them to be attackers by that. I mean, exploit the team when they're, not prepared, not ready, early in the morning, late in the evening, so that when you show up to work, that's when you have, the greatest amount of damage done because you didn't get anywhere early. So it's really important to be able to say and understand the difference between red team tests that simulate actual attacks from those suppliers, right? From the actually test running the Log4j exploit, and incident response tests, right? The actions that are taken by the men and women in your security department to protect you from this type of thing. And so that can really help you. I put it as the second highest thing you can do other than try to enable technologies that frankly give you the signal that this is happening before your users do. And that's an incredibly valuable thing to do in the SOC when you think about these types of utilities or vulnerabilities you may not even have fully documented getting exploited, right? And just preparing for that. John, back to you.
Oh, great. The idea of testing, Adam, great point, really smart point, because I'm constantly amazed how we're still having disclosures now, 3 months plus on Log4j, and these are going to be long-tail conversations, right? They're going to be tools that you're going to have in your environment that the vendors don't even exist anymore. The capabilities don't exist, and these capabilities or these challenges, this open source scenario like Log4j, is going to be here for a really long time. When we look at just Heartbleed, 6 years later on Heartbleed, we saw still thousands upon thousands of devices that were still compromisable just by doing little searches in public search engines, just by looking through different capabilities and saying, wow, there's still stuff out there. So I really like your point on testing in what we can in our environment, once it's in our environment, within the boundaries of things that fall in our environment. It's not so easy always to test a third party and say, hey, can I go bang on you? Can I go do testing and red teaming and things like that against them in their environments? But if this code's being presented to us, its capabilities presenting to our organizations, it's game on as far as I'm concerned. We've got to understand that. It's a really smart point, Adam. Really good stuff. So as I kind of bring us along to number 3, and what we were thinking about is conduct a threat and vulnerability analysis of key third-party suppliers. Now, a threat and vulnerability analysis is really a scenario-based approach to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities posed by our third parties that are key to our business processes, to our key business processes. In a threat and vulnerability analysis, we really want to sit down and have a framework of thought. We want to ask ourselves questions. What are the ways something's going to happen to us? What are the ways that possibilities that something can occur? And I always say when you're doing a threat and vulnerability analysis, you want to identify the possibilities and plan to the probabilities. Because there are many different ways things can happen. There's many different conversations of what might occur. And it's great in our roles that Adam and I have and others on this call, I'm sure, as risk and security professionals, we are exposed to so many different concepts. Our brains are wired to think about all the threats that are out there, all the different conversations that can be there. Unfortunately, we can only plan to some of them. We can only find credibility to some of them. And then by using different testing scenarios, as Adam was talking about, understanding through AI and logic concepts how behaviors are changing and how attack behaviors are changing, we can supplement our own human knowledge to understand how to do this better. How can we understand what those probabilities might look like? When it comes to supply chain, we're starting to see more and more of the supply chain becoming a risk as becoming more dependent upon it. So we need to understand what are the probabilities of there being, for instance, an outage of our cloud providers. Years ago, when we started seeing the cloud providers launch, a lot of customers I was working with saying, wow, these guys are going to be great. Amazon's going to be much better about their resiliency capabilities, their disaster recovery capabilities, all the ability to stay online better than I can. So let me go to that path. And in a lot of ways, that might be true. But in just the last couple of years, we've had significant outages for Amazon. AWS has had significant multi-day data center outages. And when you go to them and you say, what's going on? They're like, well, yep, we have problems too. You've got to worry about having your own plan of what you do to move forward. Did you have disaster recovery capabilities? Did you use other Amazon capabilities? Things of that nature. So we have to understand that there are a lot of probable scenarios that are coming up all the time that we may not have considered just even a short period ago because we're changing our operating model. The whole quote-unquote digital transformation adventure that we've gone through during the COVID experience has really accelerated taking a lot of legacy capabilities and a lot of legacy technologies and modernizing them in ways that are amazingly interesting, but have created a brand new set of challenges, have created a brand new set of capabilities. And especially the fact that we depend on a lot of third parties in supply chain, our IT supply chain, to be effective at this point. A lot of our businesses can't run without them any longer. Think about healthcare environments. We've seen ransomware attacks and things like that just in the last couple of years. Ransomware attacks against healthcare environments and hospitals and things like that are really challenging, not because the nurses and doctors who do amazing work can't provide care, but we become so dependent upon the technology to create efficiency of care that if the technology is not there, we actually have mortality rates go above. We saw this in Hollywood Presbyterian, and it was very public. We've seen in other healthcare facilities where in the ransom situations, they're forced to pay out because of the fact that they become so dependent on the technologies they're using that even though they can still provide care, they can't provide efficiently. And we've become used to that efficiency in our models. So we want to make sure we evaluate the inherent and residual risks associated with suppliers based on the current security posture and controls. So our inherent risk is going to be what could happen. What are the possibilities? If the third party is compromised in some way, what will be the case? How will it affect us? How will it affect them? How will it affect our business to do with them? In some cases, it's not as important for them to be alive and running in the case of delivered code, but if they're a service provider, that's always going to be important to us. In a delivered code model, we have to understand, all right, if they have their code as bad, our inherent risk challenging. So think Log4j. The idea that Log4j was out there immediately started saying to ourselves, wow, we have a lot of exposure. We have a lot of situations with delivered code that we said, geez, this is going to be bad. And we got to give the vendors time. They weren't able to respond in a moment's notice, as we saw and talked about earlier, guys like VMware, where a month they had a lot of their products actually have full patches, tested patches, capable patches. And even in the case of some of the vendors with the early patches, we had 3 Log4j updates from the Apache group before we even had a solid patchable update from them for the people to apply in their own code, in their own code bases. So we need to understand that as an inherent risk, but then understand what are our residual risks. Residual risk tells us after we've applied controls, after we apply capabilities, after we put things in place, do we still have the same level of concern? Do we have the same level of consideration? And once we understand that, we can say, geez, yeah, maybe something like a Log4j might be difficult, but we were able to do things like put web application firewalls in place, or disable certain functionality, or do certain things with the environment to start watching with behaviors, as Adam's talked about it so well already, looking for changes in behaviors, tuning our infrastructure to look for indicators of concern that might be impacting these systems, and then take action against them faster. We've got to also identify the impact of realized threats and vulnerabilities to the organization that can be sourced from our third-party supply chain. What level of effort do we do to stop this? What level of effort do we put in place? So if we do realize the threats, if the vulnerabilities become realized through our threat and vulnerability analysis, it should inform us to say, boy, what should we do? How should we act? Should we have levers or circuit breakers available with our third parties? We've seen this in other situations where we have, especially connected systems, supply chain attacks, and things like that, where we have to ask organizations, how quickly could you disconnect? How quickly could you turn down a service in such a way that it wouldn't affect your operating model in a material way? In some organizations I work with, they'll tell you that it will take hours, if not in some cases days, to meaningfully shut down a third-party supply chain because that IT supply chain of data and capability is so ingrained in the products and services they provide that if they were to cut off the supply chain immediately, they would lose a tremendous amount of operational capability in their own world. It's a graceful slowdown, not a circuit breaker. In other situations, we need that circuit breaker. And that's what the threat and vulnerability analysis is supposed to help us understand. To what degree we should put things in place, to what degree we should protect ourselves, to what degree should we have capabilities in place on this to understand where we go, what we do, how we do. And that's just a starting point. It's not meant to be the end game, but again, we're increasing that vulnerability and we're asking ourselves those tough questions. What should we do? When should we do it? To what degree we should do it? Adam, I think you got some ideas on hardening and segmenting our vendors as well. Well, why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, assuming that you do have vendors, it's important to also understand that within your environment, between your endpoints, your network, and your cloud, a lot of these suppliers have control of maybe one, maybe multiple, aspects of those systems, right? A network supplier can probably only go so far, right? What do I do if they're breached? They have access to, one catalog server, one, SQL server. What if I have a component on the endpoint, right? A PDF viewer, an agent, something like that. What happens if that gets compromised, right? Is it on multiple agents or multiple systems? And so the idea here is that, in preparation and being proactive, it doesn't just end at, understanding the vulnerability of the vendor. It also really helps to understand a lot of aspects about the vendor in terms of how you lock them down, right? Multi-factor authentication, almost always one of the first things you do when you think about how to get into an application legitimately, right? A lot of these supply chain attacks are simple credential theft from another place that end up just using legitimate credentials in the app to get into your Amazon S3 bucket or your API or something and break it down, right? And so it's really helpful to just say, what are some of the most valuable things in deploying when you have a vendor that is now giving you that shared responsibility, right? What's shared responsibility? They handle the operating system, they handle their software security, they handle their own vulnerabilities, and they send you patch updates, but you still have to configure the app securely. You have to configure multi-factor authentication. You have to configure single, sign-on. You have to configure things like password safes. You have to configure the unique passwords, right? And, if those aren't capabilities, right, within the application and that shared responsibility, you're probably dealing with a vendor that's not enterprise, right? They probably don't have, those things, and they haven't thought about those things, then they're probably not servicing companies to the level of scrutiny. It's like that music contract where they say on page 95, don't put any yellow M&Ms on the table, and they go into the room and they go, well, okay, well, there's yellow M&Ms here, so they clearly didn't read the rest of the contract. It's kind of like, if this is a problem for your vendor, there's likely a lot more, right? Similarly, if you do have native tools in your operating systems, your applications, like the whole, operating system has things to protect you, right? So segmentation, people used to think about this like the old traditional networks. It's even more valuable in things like work from home, where, your kid's, Fortnite cracker that's working next to you on the same on WLAN is going to, hack you laterally, right? So you want to make sure that your assets that are deployed remotely, your VDI, as well as your servers, leverage the firewall rules. I mean, this can't be overstated, right? You don't get access. Code has to run on systems, right? And so you have to get to those systems to run that code. If you don't have any access over the network, that's typically where, these attacks have spread out, right? So similarly, inbound, outbound, you want to make sure that, everybody's not allowed to use everything out in the cloud, and that you're able to inspect their traffic, because this is the kind of stuff where people hide their command and control, their remote code execution, the places that they're going, the locations that they're hacking you from. And so these are just very simple ways that you can segment and harden vendors, right? And in these examples, of course, this is the concept that there's something operating from the cloud, like to say that they have an endpoint agent on your system, right? Or frankly, there may be a local utility that 2 or 3 users use that get compromised. This is how you prepare for that fallout. And so obviously, in priority sequence, this is probably the third most important thing to do from a SOC perspective, is just to make sure that, you handle the unknown with the types of services like AI, that you have a good firm understanding, like we talked about just previously, on testing and identifying scenarios where things can break in with red team exercises. And then hopefully that informs how well you've hardened and continue to harden your systems from this type of attack and fallout, right? The breakout. John, over to you for
great
4.
points, Adam. No, really great things, really great ways of thinking about that. And there is only so much control we're going to have over our vendors, right? There is only so much you can do in the supply chain. There's only so much you can ask, and there's only so much you want to do. As we go into good old number 4 here, where I say create a technical and organizational measures, or TOMS, contract addendum, and this really comes out from global regulation. The concept of the TOMS was really first proposed in the GDPR regulation, European Data Privacy Regulation, but it's become a really kind of general statement of how do we start putting governance controls in place now for our supply chain. So only hope and pray that they're doing the right things and expect they're doing the right things, but there's got to be some accountability. There's got to be some governance. And a lot of what we've talked about up to this point, I think Adam did a great job just explaining how we can strengthen ourselves, we can strengthen our environments, we can understand the threats and vulnerabilities that exist, and how we need to create our own model of protection and frameworks and monitoring, which are so important. But then at some point, we keep being forward-looking. In my opinion, we've got to keep our thought process going forward and understanding, all right, how can we set expectations of what we want there to be stronger? How do we have better things in place? And that TOMS is a starting point for that. Now, those of us who are in risk and security, if we've in one way or another have probably been exposed either by us sending to others or others sending to us requirements of what they expect from us from a security perspective, especially in the last 5 or 6 years as this is becoming more and more popular from the legal perspective and as expectations have grown. So a TOMS really includes identification of expectations and requirements of security that third party must follow to do business with your organization. What do we expect them to do? What are the procedural and technical control expectations that we have? What are the application security testing expectations and requirements we have for delivered code? Application security is just growing and growing in importance and growing in capability in the last 10 years alone. It's exponentially gotten better, and expectations have gotten better. But we're also seeing such light speed development going on right now that it's really easy for bad things to propagate and permeate throughout code if not tested properly. If appropriate security controls or DevSecOps type controls aren't put in place by the vendors we're buying, we won't know if their code is actually operating properly, especially if we're getting fluid updates. If you're using things like software as a service vendors or using third parties who are writing code on a daily basis, and some days I have vendors who I know write code in the morning and push to production that night through their pipeline systems. And from a risk and security perspective, that can be kind of scary. So we want to make sure that we have expectations set with them about what we expect to see from them, what we expect from them from security testing expectations, and if they're operating environments where our data is going to be present, where we're giving them access to our data or we're giving them access to our environments in some way, or we're sending data to them, what are the technical control expectations we have of them? In so many cases, we have this problem where people say, well, security is hard. Security is difficult. Security is costly. And we have leadership teams who are taking risks that we may not feel comfortable with. And risk is an important part of any business. I'm not going to say it's not. I'm a risk first, security person second. That's the way I look at this. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with my systems, my data affecting my business, I have to decide what are the minimum standards I expect you to follow. And I want to bind you to them in some way. So make sure we have software maintenance and accountability requirements so that deficiencies will be made at a supplier's cost within a reasonable time. What is reasonable, how fast we should have, it's always a good question. And make sure the covered maintenance time to align with the expected useful life of the software that's being produced. I can only imagine others on this call deal with the same challenges I deal with, where we have some really ancient code out there. We have code that's no longer been supported by vendors for many, many years, but we're still using it. And the vendor's argument is, hey, I'm not going to support that anymore. I'm not going to provide updates to that anymore. I'm not going to do that for you anymore because we keep moving the bar forward. Well, in our organizational measures, our Tom's solution, we have to set that expectation, both our vendors and our supply chain and ourselves. What is that life cycle? What is that plan? What do we look at that? How long do we expect it to be viable? What do we want to have in place there? And then we have to kind of stick to that. And that's hard. I'm suggesting these are easy things. But these are concepts that we have to start talking to our business teams and our leadership teams as we're moving into these models where we're so heavily dependent on our supply chain to understand what is the expected useful life of these environments, and then what are we going to do when that's not there. Also, in a flow down, in a Tom's, we want to make sure we have flow down attestation. So it's very important that you have explicit language within your supplier agreements that requires that if you work with a third party and they work with another third party that interacts with our information infrastructure, our data assets, or the products and services that they're developing, that they have our expectations in line as a flow down. Make sure that it's not just one hop, but it's all hops. And make sure that vendors attest that they've viewed and actively monitored their vendors for compliance as well. The principle here has always been if we start at the top, it'll flow its way down. And we've seen regulation in the United States especially trying pushing for this. In fact, in the state of New York, if you're a banking entity that's registered in the state of New York in the United States, you actually can be held liable for the security of your third parties now. And the idea around this was that the banks have so much influence, the financial services organizations have so much influence, by holding them accountable for their third parties and holding them accountable for going to the supply chain, that the supply chain will naturally increase its capabilities all the way down to the lowest level. So by binding multiple layers of enforcement, we'll get good practices across multiple industries and multiple touch points, and we'll slowly work our way forward. We'll slowly keep this conversation progressing in such a way that we'll at least get to a reasonable level and defensible state where we all feel like we're doing the right things. Because as we said earlier, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And I'm always worried about that weakest link conversation. I'm always worried about that small vendor who said, I'm willing to take more risk, and if the product sells a lot and does really well, we'll go back and fix it later, who never does. And I've seen that a lot in my career. And that makes me worry when we think of supply chain conversations that we're seeing more and more of this innovation cycle going on, which is amazing. It's an amazing time to be involved in the industry right now. But watching this at the pace we're going, we're creating so much that we may not be taking all the right measures to make sure we're doing everything securely. And the adversary just has to be right. They just work their way into our environment once, and it's game over for all of us. So one last thing I want to put in here is just an example. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Is some sample contract language that you can use in Tom's agreements, and you can have this in the slides as you download them and use them. But this is just some legalese or some language that works really well around these three principles: the software maintenance, verification of compliance, and that right to audit. One thing you always want to make sure you have in your third-party supply chain situations and any third-party vendors you're using, that you have some right of auditability or some verification of compliance. You want to actually have some incentive or some requirement that puts them on notice that you, at your leisure or at your requirement, can ask them to prove they're doing the right things. They're doing what you asked them to do, making sure that you understand that they have some degree of accountability to do the right things. Now, I'm not trying to say anybody does anything intentionally wrong. That's not the point of that statement. But the idea being that your level of expectation may be different than theirs of what is appropriate, what is correct, what is the right thing to do from a risk and security perspective. So you want to have that verification of compliance conversation and that right to audit. And the software maintenance and accountability just binds them to make sure that they will remediate security vulnerabilities, that they will fix their problems. If it's a well-noted situation, they will do so. And they will do so in a way that's done in a responsible way within a reasonable scope of time, within a reasonable period. Adam, do you want to talk about vulnerability and threat and intel portion of this conversation?
Yeah, very briefly. I know we talk a lot about supply chain, but we also talk about taking inventory of what our users are doing. There's a lot of things they do outside our walls with our credentials and things, and the right way to index those is to look for chatter on the dark web to see whether your credentials are mentioned relative to things like LinkedIn or eBite or something else, right? Again, you wouldn't even think in most cases of these people as your suppliers, right? You're not purchasing software for them in many cases. Your users are just connecting their corporate IDs to these products, right? And so the idea is that as the landscape of single-use apps kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So too does the way that you have to sign in, and a lot of people sort of leverage either corporate IDs, corporate emails, something like that, in order to identify lost credentials that may be giving them access to that. So in a sense, the vulnerability analysis isn't complete without understanding specifically where on the dark web things might be used that are vulnerable, that maybe are indicators of attack, right? Things that maybe don't work as a patch, right? Our response to customers that had log4j vulnerabilities that were unpatched were to build a detection and a block on the indicators of the attack, right? And so that just allowed us to modify very quickly for certain products the ability to block that attack, right? So you can only do that when you understand with intelligence how the attack is actually manifesting in the wild, what samples of those attacks, having the concept of third parties that may have already been breached that you don't even realize you are connected to, getting you ahead of those problems. And so that's certainly one of the things that we like to do for prospects for free that come to us is to show them just how deep this goes for their environment with these assessments. So I won't spend too much time on it. I know we have maybe about a couple more minutes left. I want to keep some time for questions because I see them piling up in QA. So John, I'll pass back to you to go forward.
Thanks, Adam. Great point on the intel part. That kind of new intel environment that we hadn't traditionally thought about is so important. The social media is the kind of second-tier intel is so informative. Good point. So number 5, team, what Adam and I kind of really wanted to drive forward and really wanted to bring to the table was the idea of trust but verify. This is a great theme. This is a great concept. The idea of trust but verify really holds true in a lot of what we do from an information risk and security perspective, especially when it comes to our third parties. So I often suggest that we conduct evidence-supported security reviews about key third parties. You can start these things out with questionnaires. You can start these things out with a standard set of questions. Do you have this? Do you have that? And that's great to say. But you want to make sure you're backing it up with evidence-based, because evidence-based actually forces somebody to prove that they're doing the right things. Because people read questions, they say, well, I'm kind of doing that. I'm kind of doing the right things. I'm going to hit yes. I'm going to do that. Right? So I believe that you start out with a questionnaire and then make sure you have evidence that's relevant and detailed, and then follow up with interviews and ongoing dialogues for your key third parties. Not everybody. You're not going to be able to do this everywhere. But where you can at least go with the ones that are materially interesting to you, that you identify with your threat and vulnerability analysis, that's the ones we should be going after. Make sure our people, processes, procedures, and technologies are being reviewed across the board. It's not just technology, although I know we're talking about IT supply chain here. Processes, procedures are just as important as the technology we're dealing with. Make sure we're reviewing the key activities such as software development lifecycle, technical operations, and the security controls that the third party has in place. Do they account for the security risk controls that you believe are necessary and important? Because everybody's got their own view of security. Everybody's got their own view of risk, as we should, right? Different people look at perceptions in a different way. And nobody in that third party is going to care about your business as much as you're going to care about your business. That is something we know for sure. That's something that we know we can stand by. Make sure we're developing and monitoring corrective action plans for third-party supply chains. So when you find things you don't like, you can't just say we don't like this. There's got to be some ongoing communication. There's got to be some ongoing conversation that says, what happens if we don't follow these plans? What happens if we don't do these things? Make sure your third party in the supply chain has an accountability and understanding of negative outcomes for poor performance, what that means, how that works. And make sure you have an ongoing open channel of communication with the security personnel of that third party you're dealing with as well. Bidirectional intelligence sharing and information sharing is key to a good supply chain story. We often kind of look at us and them. I always think of it as a team. I look at myself as a risk security professional that I'm here and I'm with Adam and smart guys like Adam, and I need to talk to each other, share information. We really aren't any competitors at the core because our goals are the same: protect our businesses, protect our organizations. So if we cultivate a relationship that allows for honest communication without fear of negative impact, we're more likely to have more insight, to get more information, to get more open dialogue that will help us make better decisions, to give our business leaders and our control frameworks information to make informed decisions. Adam, you got some stuff on third-party vendor management as well?
Yeah, I'm going to, in the interest of time, just say, what reports do you usually collect? I think a lot of things that I hear people say is, give me a SOC 2. It's important to just understand how to interpret these reports, right? Know what you're collecting. Know what it means to have your vendor meet those requirements, right? When you go through something like a SOC 2 analysis, very popular way of doing vendor due diligence, you have to understand it doesn't stand for Security Operations Center. It doesn't mean they figured out all the top SOC use cases. It means they understand change management, that they've documented their facilities controls, that they've documented their software controls, their development process. And that's something you have to look deeply into to understand whether or not it's matching the scrutiny that you have from a security requirement, right? Are all their databases in the same data center that everybody has access to? Is it one shared system with no authentication, right? Like it could be, right? And you could still get a SOC 2 for that, right? So you have to understand that if you're not asking the right questions once you get those reports and you're just asking for the reports, you're probably leaving a lot on the table in terms of understanding the vendor's actual risk profile, right? When you collect things, it really depends on the value of your supplier, right? If they're a tier 1 supplier, right, quarterly might be valuable just to keep checking in to see where they're at, right? If they're annual, they're likely a tier 2 supplier, right? Maybe commercial off the shelf, you don't have to be as involved because, frankly, they maybe don't have to be doing as much scrutiny, or you have really high expectations, and so does the rest of the community on them to secure things, the Microsofts of the world, or low value, providers that only operate one widget in your back room kind of thing, right? And so that's really all I have to say on the subject. I think that, just to speak to some of the things that we are offering, people looking to get more direct guidance on their supply chain. We do have a few things, resources that we've included as well as part of this presentation. And so I did want to talk about, just quickly going over things like our white papers on how to secure the supply chain, Office 365 and Azure, some good guidance from former Microsoft employees there on, how to harden those assets in conjunction with us. And then, for people looking to get started on that point number 2 guidance, just the incident response guide gives you some of those use cases, those walkthroughs, some sample files to go do the actual test and start recording your own response times. Final thoughts for me, really, I'll just quickly, to close out, just speak to the idea that, it's important to understand how AI helps and how it doesn't in this aspect of your cybersecurity, framework, right? Supply chain in general, where you can control endpoint, network, and cloud, and how it can protect you against it. Making sure that you can test things within your own environment. And then essentially, a lot of the things that John talked about in conjunction with things like threat intelligence and others, just having a good understanding of where your vendor's at and how those things change, even if they don't know, right? Things like dark web monitoring for your credentials. You're not going to get too many emails from LinkedIn about it, but it's helpful to know that your credentials got lost there. John, I'll just pass it to you for this.
Yeah, no, really, really strong. I want to thank Adam because as we were developing this, we were really thinking about the new ways of thinking about third-party and supply chain. It may not all sound like new ideas that we presented throughout this dialogue, but I'm hoping we brought some new concepts to the table, some new thinking, and reinforced some old thinking, because we still need that strong foundation. We still need to understand how to do this well. And I think some of the ideas of incorporating AI and capabilities like testing and real scenario testing really forged the conversation well beyond this foundation that we've been working on for so long. And with that in mind, Terry, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm going to send it back to you to see if you want to slip in a question or two.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hats off to both you and Adam. Great job setting context. We've got breadth and depth. And as you mentioned, just a couple minutes for a question or two. Just a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, you can type your question into that text box located to the right of the presentation screen. Adam, a question that's come in from the audience, wondering how do you address that, quote, unknown lumen PDF, close quote? The questioner is asking if it's uncatalogued, if it was the entrance, and then how you can then make the enterprise realize how casual installs can affect the entity as a whole. Do you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. When they say shared responsibility, security is everyone's responsibility. When you think about the provider, right, the person who makes the operating system, the person who makes the detection and response software, a lot of them are trying to handle the idea that you can put a lot of stuff on that general purpose operating system and break things. Your IT guy can do a lot of the hardening, vulnerability analysis, segmentation, and try to lock down the system with, only user rights and software restriction policies and all these other things that Windows and other programs give them to harden their systems against somebody installing an unknown piece of software. But you also have to focus on the fact that the user has those capabilities, browser plugins, tiny utilities that can, usually go unlooked by that stuff. You're giving them the rights to run software just by giving them the asset. So they should be trained, right? There's security awareness training to talk about, when you should bring IT to stuff. Shadow IT has been a problem for a long time. People bringing their own PDF viewer to work, not new, right? And people want to get things done in a pinch. They don't want to have to go to IT for every request. And so, as locked down as we can make a system, it kind of forces the function to say, you have to come to me to get this done. People don't necessarily like that. You do have to embrace their requests. You do have to show them that things get done through you. Because they're people, right? They will go where their job gets done to other parties that will give them that access, or other utilities that will make it work online. And then you have data loss because they're uploading your, financial spreadsheets to a PDF converter online that's keeping the file, right? So what's important, I think, is just to understand the shared responsibility, what you're supposed to control, how you're supposed to embrace the user's request, but also train them, give them awareness, see where they're at, measure where they're at, and that's part of shared responsibility.
Adam, thank you. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions today. Again, I want to thank John Paranti and Adam Mansour. Dark Reading appreciates your time and expertise on today's topic. Thank you as well to our sponsor, Act Zero, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to listen to today's event. This webinar is copyright by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Act Zero, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, Act Zero, I'm Terry Sweeney from Dark Reading. Thanks again for your time. Have a great day.